nice paper on the role of timing in a frozen embryo transfer, and was published in November 2022 in Fertility by Sarah Lenson, and it also has contributions from a friend of mine, Mohan Kamath. So I'm going to divide this into certain parts, and first we'll go on to endometrial thickness. Now, in 2014 was a mega study, a meta-analysis of 22 studies which suggested that when the endometrial thickness was less than 7 millimeter, pregnancy rates were lower. Now, when you go on and look at different studies, there was another study which was on 20,114 cycles, and when the endometrial thickness declined, there was a decline in each millimeter of pregnancy rate. So if you looked at a live birth rate of 28.4% for 8 millimeter, it came down to 27.4% between 7 and 7.9 millimeter, 23.7% between 6 and 6.9 millimeter, 15% from 5 and 5.9, and ironically 21% between 4 and 4.9, and that must have been outliers would have changed it. But remember, even with thin lining, it seemed that pregnancy rates were still reasonably good. Now, another paper suggested of 10,000 cases that the cutoff should be 8.7 millimeter, and the live birth rates seemed to plateau after that. Now, another study suggested that while it seemed to plateau in a frozen transfer, it continued to increase in a fresh cycle till 10 to 12 millimeters. So there seems to be a discrepancy between what happens in a frozen and a fresh cycle. So what it means is that the pregnancy rates do not decline, but the pregnancy rates may plateau once you cross 8 millimeter in a frozen cycle. The second question is endometrial compaction. There were papers which suggested that if endometrial compaction was good, then the chances of pregnancy were better. This has been refuted in other studies, and I don't think it matters. What may be useful in some cases is the level of blood supply on ultrasound Dopplers. And again, there's been no convincing study about it. The next subject we go to, duration of progesterone administration. So there has been a study which looked at day 5 progesterone and day 3 progesterone. The pregnancy rates were very similar. The miscarriage rates were much higher, of almost 55% when progesterone was given. There was another open label RCT which was done, which looked at day 7 and day 5 of progesterone supplementation and found results to be approximately similar. So what it is telling us is that in both the studies, that if you give progesterone at a lower level and a less amount of progesterone, you're more likely to see a higher loss of pregnancy. Now, people have looked at using 6 and 7 days of progesterone, and they haven't seen a huge drop to live birth rates. And that's where the big question that comes up in endometrial receptivity. They also looked at natural and modified natural embryo transfer, and it seems that, at least in smaller studies, pregnancy rates may be better. Now, when should we transfer the embryos? And the transfer of the embryos should be 7 days after LH surge, day 1 being the LH surge, and 8 day when HCG was used. But remember, even if you use it Monday to Monday, that means trigger on a Monday and transfer on a Monday, or LH surge on a Monday and transfer on a Monday, so that's 7 days to 8 days, the implantation window seems to me much more broader in nature than compared to that of using a medicated cycle. So if you look at almost all these studies, these pregnancy rates is much better. There seems to be a variation between looking at how many days after trigger or LH surge you should do it, but it seems to be 7 to 8 days seems to be the right number. Now, at what stage the question here comes up is, what stage should the embryos be transferred? And what we know is that day 5 embryos, whether they be euploid or whether they are untested, seems to have a better live birth rate compared to day 6 and day 7 embryos. So, as studies have gone by, it seems to show that embryos that become a blastocyst at a later time may have a lower chance of pregnancy. Also, how long should we warm the blastocyst? And here again, we don't have a consensus. If you warm a blastocyst and transfer the embryos early or keep it for a few hours, the results seem to be very similar. Now, the challenging part comes in about endometrial receptivity assays, and we have got a number of endometrial receptivity assays. The commonest one is called the endometrial receptivity assay, which is called the ERA. Then we've got the WIN test, we've got the RNA sequential based receptivity test, the ER map, the ER peak, and Be Ready. A lot of them, but only one of these tests has been subjected to properly regulated randomized controlled trials, and that's the ERA. And it's not been very convincing, and the data does not suggest there's a huge change in pregnancy rates. The other tests have not have such a robust RCTs behind them. So, the reason I would suggest this paper is worth reading is mainly because if you have a look at it, you'll find it as the role of timing in a frozen embryo transfer, November 22, number 5, volume 118. And something worth reading this paper. It gives us an idea about a few things. It tells us about endometrial thickness. It tells us about what the endometrial thickness should be. And any thickness more than 8 millimeter in frozen is good. For a fresh, it seems to vary between 8 and 12. A compaction, there's a question. Dopplers, a question mark. We don't have many studies. We are looking at day 5 embryos having a better implantation. If you're regarding timing, 5 days of progesterone seems to be the ideal for a blastocyst, but giving fewer days of progesterone seems to be detrimental. There are studies which say that if you give 1 more day of extra progesterone, there does not seem to be a decline in live birth rates, but that's something which we don't do. Natural cycles and modified natural work much better, and they are more cumbersome, but the pregnancy rate seems to be very good. And again, it's a Monday trigger, a Monday LH surge, and 7 days later, on the 8th day, you can do a transfer. With endometrial receptivity assays, none of these tests have stuck to the randomized controlled trials. So in short, a very concise paper and very well written, which will help us to give a general idea about the timing of frozen embryo replacement. Thank you.